Do you ever wonder how a specific artwork would have turned out had it been done by a different artist? Let's say The Lord of the Rings if George Martin wrote it. I mean, apart from not having an ending, how long would Frodo even survive? Jokes aside, even if we keep the same core idea, each artist has a unique voice, based on their technical skills, their preferences, and their artistic sensibilities. These elements are likely to determine to a significant degree how an artist develops any given idea. So the question is, to which extent does an idea determine the final result? In this episode we will make an experiment. I am joined today by Galluzzo, an experienced composer and fellow YouTuber. Our goal is to define a specific idea that each of us will develop in their own style. Now, defining the idea is clearly the most delicate aspect of our experiment. We wanted to make sure we were both aligned on the intention of the piece, as well as basing our work on the same common musical elements. We decided to start from the rules of a recent competition, where each entry had to be based on this picture, it had a time limit of 90 seconds, and had to be an orchestral piece for these instruments. But this isn't enough. We also needed to base our work on the same interpretation of the image, as well as be using the same musical building blocks. Therefore, we agreed on these additional rules. First, our work should represent the creature in the picture as a kami, a godlike creature that lives in harmony with nature. In this sense, we wanted our music to capture a sense of majesty and of harmony, almost in a relaxing or soothing way, in a sense. Second, we wanted to go for a soundscape that is a mix between Japanese and African styles, as much as that is possible in an orchestral context. Finally, we agreed on these two musical elements. The first one was using drums, so both of our compositions should make use of percussions in a relatively predominant way. The second element is basing our work on this theme and its variations. Alright, now that we have defined the idea, let's see what happened.
The first thing I did when Michele sent me the theme he wanted to use was, of course, to change it. I added a little bit of additional rhythmic interest to the first half of the theme, and I adapted the second half so that it was just a copy of the first half transposed down by a fifth. Why? Well, 90 seconds is not a very long time at all. If the track had lasted longer, I could have simply repeated the theme several times with some, different variations in order to reinforce it, but even with just a short 4-bar theme at a slow, relaxed tempo, I didn't have that luxury of time. So I wanted to help the theme to stick in the listener's brain better by having those distinctive rhythms, and then I reinforced it further by basically repeating the same phrase twice during the course of the theme. Now, this theme is built on 2 pentatonic scales, suggesting that Japanese character, and I did some additional things to enhance that, like adding a piccolo, doubling the theme 2 octaves higher. And a harp mimicking a koto by playing short pentatonic glissandi. But the chords underneath the theme don't follow these pentatonic scales. Instead, they use more Western harmony. Why? Simply because the audience for this piece is mostly a Western audience, and I could use traditional Western tonal progressions to create that sort of tension and release in a way that the audience would be familiar with. As far as the structure of the piece, nothing about the theme really screamed jungle to me, so I decided to write a little introduction to set the stage, using the upper winds to imitate bird calls at the beginning using the Japanese pentatonic scale, with the strings in the background playing quiet harmonics over a 5-octave spread. At the end of the introduction, the drums come in playing a regular pattern, since Michele and I had agreed that the track should have a constant percussion rhythm in the background. Now, I knew I wanted to have the theme repeat twice, with a bigger orchestration the second time, and I wanted an 8 to 10 bar coda at the end. I was planning on having a nice long section after the introduction where I would have plenty of time to develop those motives until the full theme came in, but once I looked at the amount of time I had left out of 90 seconds, there was only room for about 8 bars of development. So all I had time for was putting a couple motives from the theme in the first trombone and first trumpet, and I left it at that. With all that being said, here's the final track. Now let's see what Michele came up with.
When I started writing my piece, I knew I wanted to give it a circular shape in terms of intensity. This means the piece will start with an intro that acts like a fade-in. It will then grow in intensity until we reach the climax, and the piece would end in a sort of a fade-out. I think this is an effective approach, especially for short pieces like this one, because it creates a clear sense of beginning and end, and this results in a strong sense of direction. I think this is important because it makes it easier for the listener to make sense of what they are hearing. In other words, it should result in an easier listening experience. The first part I wrote were the percussions. In my composition, this is the most important layer because they essentially act as the backbone to the entire piece. The idea I was going for was some sort of tribal and almost ritualistic approach to the drum patterns. It goes on and on for the entire duration of the piece with very little variation. Once I had this foundation, I added the theme, repeated in waves with increasing intensity, with different orchestral layers. So the idea is quite simple. I have a percussive foundation that ties everything together, and on top of this we have multiple instances of the same theme with slight variations that essentially creates this wave of intensity that I was talking about at the beginning. And this is how it turned out. So we have followed quite different approaches in our pieces. Are there parts you like more in your version than in mine, or do you see any significant differences?
Yeah, I think there are some significant differences in our approaches. So I think your track has a lot of that sort of African and Japanese influence. So, for example, a lot of Japanese music is often like monophonic, and so your approach is sort of probably more true to the ethnic influences that you were trying to capture than mine is. On mine, I was trying to capture those, but also sort of appeal to a more Western aesthetic where you have some harmony, you have a bunch more layers. And I kind of like those layers. To me, it feels a little fuller. So that aspect of mine, I would say I prefer, and I prefer the rhythmic and percussive aspect of yours. I think you really captured the influences you were trying to capture very well.
I think you actually, as you mentioned, you had a much richer approach. So a lot of interesting elements coming up. So that is something that, from my point of view, I definitely envy of your approach, like having these, these different layers. On the other side, maybe you had to compromise a little bit on, the raw effectiveness of the theme itself.
So one thing I was trying to do also is, um, I took the theme and I broke it up into little motifs, and then I used those like in the bird calls and in the 5 octave spread. I subtly used a couple of those motifs to try to sort of get the listener's brain ready to hear the full theme. Sibelius did a lot of that, right? He would break up a theme into motives, and then he would use a few motives, and then finally they'd all assemble into the theme, and it would feel kind of inevitable. Well, I tried to do that, and it like I had ended up having like 8 bars to try to build some of those up, plus the bird calls, which were built from some of those motifs, and it just sort of it didn't work nearly as well as I wanted it to. If I had had like an extra 2 minutes or something, it probably would have worked really well. The approach that I took ended up being more suitable for a longer piece than I actually had time for.
Yeah, for sure. I think for sure the time limitation is quite limiting in terms of having the opportunity to really develop the material
Mhm.
properly over a larger time span. And following up on this topic, I had another question for you, which is, given the rule set that we agreed upon, do you think it really influenced the way you composed? Or do you feel they just acted like some sort of inspiration that you could use
Mhm.
and apply your style freely?
That's a really great question. So I think it's somewhere, it's both. Of course, I'm going to say it's both, but I do feel like it was both. So my typical style is fairly like modern classical. You know what I mean? So I use a lot of dissonance, a lot of interesting extended techniques and effects and things like that. However, the idea that we agreed to use was entirely pentatonic, completely pentatonic, which means it has no dissonance. So I chose to make my composition in almost more of a popular style or cinematic maybe style than most of the stuff that I write. On the other hand, the approach that I took to the structure of the piece and to the layering and so forth is very similar to how I usually write. And in addition, the fact that I was looking into like Japanese and African music gave me a little bit of additional kind of like we said, sort of tools in the tool belt. You know what I mean? And so I found that to be a very interesting and sort of inspiring place to take the composition.
Yeah, and also for me personally, the choice of trying to capture
Mhm.
specific ethnical sounds,
Uh-huh.
that was quite challenging. So I don't know
Yes.
about you, but I started like listening to African music, which
Uh-huh.
I never did before,
Yeah.
or listening to Japanese traditional
Yeah.
music. So trying to merge these two
Uh-huh.
different styles has
Mhm.
been definitely like the element of interest in these two compositions. Like
Yeah.
it forced us to, at least to some extent, to leave our comfort zones and to try to, experiment with something new, at least to some degree. And another question I had for you was, so we didn't mention this at the beginning of the video, but on an actual time scale, what happened is we both participated in a competition, which, by the way, you won. Then, after the competition, I reached out with the idea of seeing how my idea would have been developed by another person. So my question for you is, did you feel in some way influenced by already having a piece that is essentially the source of the ideas in a way?
Um, that's a great question. So it didn't influence me a whole lot. And the reason for that is, I did listen to your track, I think, before I wrote mine, but it was quite a bit beforehand. And I purposely didn't listen to it like a bunch because I wanted to write my own piece and not really pay attention to that track, because the whole idea was, well, how would two composers approach this same task, right, with the same musical material? So if I listened to You're the Bunch, I probably would have written something very similar, right? So I didn't want to do that. And so I purposely sort of set that to one side. And then I started basically from scratch and said, okay, let me write my own piece.
Okay, great. So I'm glad to hear that we managed to keep it as authentic as possible, thanks to your approach of avoiding the original source in a way. Okay, so one thing I wanted to experiment with was to see how two composers of very different levels of experience would approach one idea. So what I wanted to ask you is, do you think my result would have been very different or maybe more similar to yours with more technical experience? Or would your approach have been very different if you had less experience?
So when I think about pieces that I wrote 15 or 20 years ago, some of them are quite good and some of them are pretty awful. So I guess what I'd say then is I used to have good ideas, and I still have hopefully good ideas, right? But I have a broader range of tools with which to manipulate those ideas. I'm able to do so more quickly and more reliably, right? Because I've done this now for a long time, and so I'm more confident that what I produce is fairly good, and I have a better idea how to structure things. I have a better idea how to approach things. So yeah, I would say it's not so much that additional experience will necessarily totally change your composition, as it will help you to more reliably write good things faster.
Okay, and Derek, I wanted also to ask you, did you expect the end result of our two compositions to be this different? Or did you expect them to be much more similar, given the fact that we defined quite a strong set of rules? I mean, they were quite constraining, to be honest, in terms of what we had to do.
Uh-huh. That's a good question. I guess I didn't really have a preconceived idea of how similar they would be, but I thought it was really interesting to see the differences in our approaches and in the end result, right? So the differences in structure, the differences in harmony, the differences in contrapuntal treatment, the differences in rhythmic material. And so I thought it was really interesting to see how different they were, and in some ways how similar, right? So the actual harmonic language in the two tracks was fairly similar as well. We were both influenced by the sort of pentatonic scale, but we also had some Western, like you had a big, lovely D major chord, like about 2/3 of the way through your track, that just felt like the heavens opening up. When you finally had that nice, satisfying D major chord. And in the similar way, at the very end of my track, I purposely withheld any tonic chord up until the very, very end of my track, so that the last chord, you finally got that resolution, and it kind of felt satisfying. So it was interesting that we both had a similar sort of harmonic idea as well.
Yeah, this is interesting also because actually for me, one of the most challenging parts of this composition was the harmonic language.
Mhm.
So harmony is something I struggle with quite a lot. So it's interesting to see that you noticed this similarity in the harmonic direction of the piece, despite the fact that the harmonic language that we use is on different levels. Mine being very basic, where yours, it had much more development.
Yeah.
I think this is an interesting observation of how technical expertise can manifest itself in more subtle technicalities. And Eric, before you go, one last question. Where can people find you on the internet?
Well, thanks for asking me, Haley. So I do have a YouTube channel, which you can find linked to in the corner of this video. I have an Instagram channel as well, where you can find a few of my short compositions. And finally, I have a website, ericgalluzzo.com, that has a lot of my compositions on it and scores and parts.
So thanks for joining, Eric, and thanks for taking part in this experiment, despite the amount of effort it required you.
Well, thanks for having me on, Michele. It's been great fun, and I really enjoyed participating in this challenge. If any of our viewers would like to do the same, the rules can be found toward the beginning of this video. And if you do end up producing something based on those, please leave it in the comments. We'd love to listen to what you come up with.
Yeah, I agree, Eric. That's a great idea. So if anyone wants to leave their creation in the comments, we will happily check it out. All right, that's it for this episode. I hope you found it interesting, and thanks for watching. See you in the next one.